Well, tonight we are one thing that has been great about these Zoom meetings is that we've got to hear from speakers that we would normally not be able to hear from because of travel restrictions. So we're very pleased tonight to have Michael, hopefully I pronounced your name right, Emich,
Yep, that's correct.
and Bill Armstrong here. They have written a book called Hands Off. That is the story of their activities in gas ballooning and other things that they've done over the years.
Thank you, Susan, for inviting us to spend a few minutes with you guys tonight. And I am certainly glad to be back in Texas and seeing a lot of familiar faces and lots of names that I remember. And one of my best times in Austin was at the Broken Spoke with Tim Baggett, Phil McNutt, Brian Critelli, and I don't remember who else was there after the evening got late, but it was a great time. So we're going to share some of the history and development of the largest and the most active gas balloon club in the United States.
You know, Mike and I both grew up in Northeast Ohio, and we had the privilege of getting to know some of the early gas balloon pilots in the middle of the last century. About a year ago, Mike and I were reflecting on how lucky we had been to have these guys as friends and as mentors, and they were willing to teach us the fine art of gas ballooning. So we realized that if we didn't write down what we knew about them and the stories we'd heard from them and what we knew about their adventures, their stories would actually be lost. Besides, there hadn't been a book written about gas ballooning in the United States for more than 40 years. So these guys were promoters and they were pioneers in the 1950s. Our story sort of starts there. Most of these people that we're going to talk about were fixed-wing pilots who worked at Goodyear, where, of course, Light of the Air was a big program.
The story of ballooning in Akron begins with Goodyear, as Bill mentioned, and specifically at the historic Wingfoot Lake blimp hangar. Gas balloon training had started there even before World War I, and it's the oldest active airship base in the U.S., and we think in the world. Bill and I spent many Saturdays in there as young guys helping the club. They call them work parties. So we would go in and help put grip panels in, rig baskets, sort out equipment, you name it. It was just filled with history. They had a World War II Corsair there, K-ship, gondolas, you name it, it was in there. And it was just fascinating for me as a young lighter than air enthusiast.
So one of the earliest Goodyear balloon pilots was a guy named Ralph Upson, who had won the U.S. National Gas Balloon Race in 1913. And he went on to represent the United States in the Gordon Bennett competition in Europe. And he astonished everybody over there by winning the Gordon Bennett Trophy and brought it back to Akron. Ralph Upson then trained another young pilot named Ward Van Orman, who would go on to win 5 national balloon races and 3 Gordon Bennett trophies, each time representing the Goodyear Corporation as the chief pilot there.
Van Orman was legendary. In one Gordon Bennett flight in 1925, launching from Brussels, Belgium, he and his aide drifted out over the Atlantic at night, hoping for a wind that would bring them up the west coast of Ireland, but it wasn't there. So miraculously, they landed on a ship at night, and they were disqualified. And Van Orman never forgave the organizers for that. And stories like this and other adventures of Ward is called The Wizard of the Winds. And still available. It's a rare book these days, but you can still find it. And I encourage you to try and get a copy of it.
The sport ballooning and competition was suspended during the Second World War, but the Navy used gas balloons to train blimp pilots. And the blimps, of course, escorted merchant ship convoys, hunted submarines, and patrolled the coastlines. After the Second World War, the Navy began winding down its Light of the Air program.
In the early 1950s, Goodyear sponsored an employee activity called the Wingfoot Lighter Than Air Society. And it started with a small group of men and women who simply wanted to preserve Akron's LTA history and heritage. And they published a monthly bulletin that was full of useful information. And the prime movers in this new club were four men. Most of our book revolves around them. On the left is Roger Walcott, and he was the first president of the Lighter Than Air Society. He helped establish the Gas Balloon Club, and he was a fabrics engineer at Goodyear, and he previously worked at Taylor Craft Aircraft Company in Alliance, Ohio. And he also held a patent on the Goodyear inflatoplane, an inflatable aircraft. Art Swanson on the right, it was a great stick and rudder man, and he was a mechanic for the Wingfoot Flyers, which was a fixed wing club, fixed wing employees activity at Goodyear. And he was a genuine hero at Goodyear after he saved a Navy blimp during World War II, crawling out on the engine pod to extinguish an in-flight fire.
Two of the other characters who founded our clubs were Jimmy Contos here on the left. It's kind of a scrappy, independent, forward-looking kind of guy. Also a pioneer in many respects who just thought outside the box and sometimes set his own course. Some of you might know the name of Don Overs on the right. Don was a quiet, reserved man who was clearly the scholar in the group. Don later wrote the Balloon Federation of America manual on flammable gases based on his experiences flying not only with hydrogen, but also with helium, natural gas, coke gas, and various mixtures of all those kind of gases.
When the U.S. Navy decided to sell off some surplus assets after World War II, our guys knew a good deal when they saw one and got to work with the help of some old Goodyear old-timers and began preparing that equipment.
But Goodyear corporate directors really didn't want an employee group flying old surplus balloons around. So the guys had to form their own club called National Lighter Than Air. And they built nets and they patched up old baskets, checked valves and load rings, and started a ground school, recruited flight instructors from the ranks of Goodyear blimp pilots who had recently been trained themselves.
Importantly, the club found a source of cheap gas, and it was right there in the 1917 Goodyear manual. And it was coal gas, which is a byproduct of steel making. Our student pilots made a deal with Republic Steel in Massillon, Ohio, which is just 20 miles from Akron. And all they had to do was hook up the inflation hose and turn on the gas.
And that's what they did. Like any fair club, they shared flying time. The people who put in the most work earned the most points for a flight, and they got to go up more often. Our club members made their first flight on September 28th, 1956. They made a couple hops during the day, traded passengers. And at the end of the day, it looked like this. They landed in a tree. But they were learning and they knew how to patch things up. So they kept going. In the first 2 years, our guys made a total of 48 flights from that steel plant. Their flights began to get some publicity. Flying Magazine, which was once the most widely circulated aviation magazine anywhere, did a cover story about the Akron Balloon Club and about our sister club over in Philadelphia. Then the Ohio Bell Telephone Company made a newsreel film about the club showing every detail of their preparation and flying. This 10-minute clip, we can't show you the whole clip here, but it shows them chasing across dusty roads, leaping through fields, and learning about flying. If you do want to see the whole clip, it's available on the BFA website. You can take a look at that under the video section. It's kind of fun to watch, those old cars and people hopping over fences to chase the balloons.
Our club members were helped by men such as Ralph Houston on the left and Augie O'Neill. He was a legendary blimp pilot, the fellow on the right. Among other people who flew with them were Connie Wolf, some of you may know that name, who in 1961 set a women's distance and duration record in a flight from Big Spring, Texas. And she was the wife of the AOPA founder, General Alfred Wolf. And then there was also an Akron school teacher that I didn't know about. We found out during our research for this book. Her name is Jean Hickson, and she flew with our club. And she was the second woman to break the sound barrier, and a member of the so-called Mercury 13, who would have been, she would have become one of America's first female astronauts.
Before we leave this slide, I just want to point out Connie Wolf's hairnet. It's not just a fashion statement or to keep her hair in place. She wore a hairnet every day because she said it reminded her of the net over a gas balloon. She was really committed to the whole sport. Anyway, then a recession hit the steel industry. The steel plant closed and our supply of coke gas disappeared. So our club headed over to Philadelphia for some flying with the Balloon Club of America and Tony Fairbanks, who at that time was the nation's only civilian balloon pilot examiner. They did that for like a period of 6 years. We had some flight, one or two, or sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 balloons in the air at the same time.
Soon our guys found out that they could put money in the club treasury by doing commercial tether work with hydrogen-filled balloons. And they did quite a bit of this for Ford Motor Company, and then also for a Chevy dealership in Peoria, Illinois. And back in the early 60s, I was walking home from elementary school one day with a friend, and I looked up and I saw a silver balloon overhead, and it said U.S. Navy on the side. So I perked up because my dad was a World War II Navy veteran. And we were fascinated with this thing. It was right about lunchtime. I decided that that's what I wanted to do someday. And many years later, I learned that up in that balloon was a man named Don Overs, and it was his solo flight. And he was the guy that eventually signed me off for my gas balloon rating 25 years later.
We still needed to have our guys certified and get their check ride. So Tony Fairbanks came over to Ohio to give a check ride to Don Overs and Art Swanson. Fairbanks, by the way, had been a founder of the Cleveland Balloon Club back in the 1930s and participated in the last U.S. national balloon race in 1936. It took off from Denver, Colorado, and they landed in Akron, Colorado, only 100 miles away.
In those days, a balloon license was still a requirement to get an airship rating. And Goodyear hired our club to train 3 pilots. And they actually got to fly with helium inflated in the hangar right at Wingfoot Lake. Meanwhile, our club member Jimmy Contos was experimenting independently with his own version of a hot air balloon. And this was well before Ed Yost. Contos' idea was to inflate the balloon the way the old smoke balloonists did, strung between 2 trees. And the first burner that in our research we found, he used a salamander heater as the burner. And Jimmy also made a number of tethered cluster balloon flights, and those were with hydrogen. And then he finally made a free flight in September 1959 to 11,000 feet. And this is well before any of today's cluster balloon pilots.
Jimmy Contos got a lot of media attention, and his notoriety and his friendship with the Philadelphia club produced a call from a man in New York named Rodney Anderson. He's an amateur who wanted to make a transatlantic flight. Remember the Free Life? You might remember the Free Life. Anderson's wife, Pamela, was an actress, and she was also an heir to the Kentucky Fried Chicken fortune. And they hired Jim Contos to test fly a balloon that had already been built by Mark Emich of Idaho. Contos then added his own innovative ideas to the system and flew what is now recognized as the first modern Rosier combination of helium and hot air balloon. Now you see the tear in the lower half, the air compartment. He had that tore on takeoff, and he had a few other issues that prevented a long flight. But the seeds of an idea were planted here, and these would later be be imitated with great success. When the organizers rejected some of Cantos' suggested modifications, he backed out and he was replaced by Malcolm Brighton of England. Of course, as you may know, the Free Life transatlantic attempt in 1970 ended in the loss of 3 lives, Anderson, his wife, and Mr. Brighton. Life magazine stayed with the story, covered the whole thing, and did a couple of pages after their disappearance. Jimmy Cantos autographed this page here. You can see in the lower left for Mike.
The club's various activities and visibility through the Wingfoot Lighter Than Air Society bulletin brought it to the attention of a real German rocket scientist, and his name's Kurt Staehling. He worked for NASA. He was involved in the Vanguard project, America's first satellite. Kurt used his Washington connections to arrange several flights for the club. He and Don Overs carried weather sensors on a flight out of South Dakota, and they tried to make an official commemorative flight from the NASA Scientific Balloon Center at Palestine, Texas, and for the centennial of helium in 1968. But at the last minute, the poly balloon broke loose, and that was before they got in and took off, and that may have saved their lives.
Art Swanson then flew with Staehling from Sioux Falls in 1973, carrying a bunch of military instruments and trying to set a record. They flew for 650 miles, but they had a terrible forecast, and they barely survived a 40-mile-per-hour hard landing in Spearman, Texas, about that flight. They sort of ended Swanson's flying days. He was in the intensive care unit for a couple of days and hospital for a few weeks. Staehling wrote about this in True magazine, as you can see the cover story and the artist sketch of their impending perilous landing. But perhaps the flight with the most lasting impact associated with our club was for the IMAX documentary made for the National Air and Space Museum. Ground scenes were filmed in Vermont, and the flying scenes were shot in West Virginia. When it was finished, it was hailed as the most spectacular IMAX documentary of all time. Our club members, Don Overs, you can see here on the left, and Kurt Staehling at the top hat. Roger Walcott, Kissel, and Kurt Staehling were all involved as pilots. The Overs during the flying sequences had to hide under a canvas cover in the bottom of the basket so he wouldn't be caught on camera. It was pretty hot down there, but they did that. So when the film premiered in 1976, Michael Collins, who was the Apollo 11 command pilot and the new director of the Air and Space Museum, welcomed our pilots at the premiere. It's such a great film that the Library of Congress chose it for archiving and the National Film Registry. So it's right up there with Gone with the Wind, Star Wars, and E.T., other great aviation films. Ronald Reagan even presented a copy of this film to Soviet Premier Michael Gorbachev.
By 1974, we had each earned our hot air balloon licenses, and Bill flew in Albuquerque during the first World Hot Air Championship. And then I made my first flight in 1972 in first free flight in Randolph, Ohio, right across the street from Roger Wolcott's house. And that is Jimmy Cantos on the left, myself, Judy and Fred Kissel in the middle. That was Fred Kissel's balloon. Peter Carpenter, and then there's Art Swanson on the right. And that's a Picard basket and burner system. And then Fred got through an auction 105,000 cubic foot Raven envelope. So he combined the two, and it was, my first flight was in an experimental combination balloon. So it was a real privilege for me.
So by 1981, Goodyear needed space at Wingfoot Lake, where all of our stuff had been stored all those years. The club called a work party to move the gas balloons to a private storage facility. And it was there that Mike and I began to learn how to inspect, how to patch and repair and maintain this collection. we had our eyes on one of these balloons. It was a 19,000 cubic foot training balloon that we wanted to sort of adopt for our own use. So we put special effort into that.
Downovers, Fred Kissel, and then Ken Leeds built a new net, and that was virtually a lost art at that time. And the club actually traded this net to Don Picard for a brand new Picard hot air balloon. And by 1983, we were ready to begin our training, and we asked Downovers to be our instructor. We arranged for delivery of $700 worth of hydrogen in banks, cylinders, to Akron Municipal Airport.
So this is a big deal in Akron. We had lots of help on our first flight, and we took off early in the morning and flew into Western Pennsylvania, taking very careful notes in a logbook we created and learning how much just a coffee can full of sand will send us up. When we landed in Pennsylvania, we deflated by removing the valve, and that actually saved a lot of time and effort, because when you rip a gas balloon out, it takes a while to re-cement the whole panel in and then let it dry and cure, and taking the valve out and deflating that way, just a big step saver. It was one of Don Over's favorite techniques.
After one more day flight, we decided on an overnight flight. And we flew from Akron to a small town in West Virginia called Lumberport. Night flying was truly the best, and we had a lot of confidence in ourselves and our equipment by that time. And soon we were ready for more.
And by that, Mike, means that the next flight took us north from Akron, across Lake Erie at night, and into Canada. Of course, just before we left, we had a visit from Mike Fitzpatrick, who was one of the Goodyear blimp pilots who came over and helped us move sandbags down the net, and then did a flyby as we're preparing to take off. We carried an aircraft radio on this flight, but we couldn't get a response when we entered Canadian airspace. And we actually flew across the top of Toronto at night. Beautiful city at night if you're sneaking across the border. We communicated by CB radio with ground stations, who relayed what we thought was our position to our chase crew back in Akron. After 14 hours, we landed on a small farm 50 miles south of Ottawa. And we called the Canadian customs officer, who came over, was very good to us, and gave us a permit to take our balloon back across the border.
We figured if we could do that in our little 19,000 cubic foot hydrogen balloon, we could do more. So we set our sights on the U.S. national distance record for category AA4, and it was a pretty ambitious idea with the equipment that we had. The record had been set in 1927 by Tex Settle, and then later he became Vice Admiral Tex Settle. He was Navy airship and balloon ace and former competitor of Ward Van Orman. And the Weather Channel agreed to do our forecast. These are days before dawn day. We flew for 17 hours, and we crossed Lake Erie again, flew up through upstate New York, and it was under a full moon. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous night flight. And then we landed in a suburb of Boston 515 miles later, and we beat the record, and we received a lot of acclaim for this. And actually, the BFA awarded us the Shields Trauger Award for that flight. And the Lighter Than Air Society gave us their Achievement Award.
During the record ceremony at the Air and Space Museum, Vice Admiral Ed Martin, who was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air Warfare and a former POW, who, by the way, had been a jailmate with Joe Kittinger in that Hanoi Hilton. He asked if we could bring a balloon to help celebrate the 75th anniversary of naval aviation in Pensacola, Florida. It's a pretty good offer, so we said yes to that. And that led to a series of military flights where we could use government helium. We also flew for the Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where this elderly gentleman, a good friend of ours, came over to look us over and wish us well. And we made an official postal commemorative flight for the Navy. And we had the Rubber City Stamp Club design and sell special balloon mail that paid for all of our expenses for this flight. Later, we made a couple of tethered flights at Lakehurst for the 75th anniversary of the historic Hangar 1.
In 1987, we were invited to a gas balloon race at Jacques Sokup's estate in eastern Pennsylvania. Don Overs joined us there, along with 11 teams of gas balloonists, including Tony Fairbanks. And all the competitive gas balloon pilots gave Don and Tony a great big welcome. It was just a perfect weather weekend. The flight the next morning was just spectacular, as you can see by the photos. And for one last time, the nation's two oldest gas balloon clubs were in the air again at the same time. But sadly, it turned out to be the last gas balloon ascents for the long careers of both Tony Fairbanks and Don Overs. And symbolically, our balloon landed on a pile of discarded tires, which we thought was pretty neat since we're both from the Akron area. And Don Overs' family later gave us his photos, papers, and logbooks from his estate to help in writing this book.
So we were involved in a couple other expeditions as well. I served in 1974 as the communications director for Tom Gatch's 1974 transatlantic flight. I think, if my memory is correct, that Carl Steffen Jr. was the NAA official observer there. Maybe Carl can confirm that later. And his father had given Tom Gatch some guidance about scientific high-altitude superpressure balloons that Tom followed. Anyway, Mike and I both participated in Larry Newman's Earth Winds project in Akron. Mike was chosen as a crew member for the second flight, but Mike is a smart man, and wisely he withdrew for a number of reasons and to ensure his own safety. We met some great people along the way in this project, including Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon. There he is visiting with us at the Goodyear Air Dock in Akron. Anyway, Mike and I have had a huge amount of fun in gas ballooning, and we became well versed in its history and some of its unique characters. Two of them are here, Paul Kipfer and Auguste Piccard, who were mocked severely by Ward Van Orman, our original hero, because they wore chicken baskets as helmets. And we had great instructors, and we had good luck. We often had free helium and some free equipment, because we paid $1 a piece for those envelopes back in the 1950s. We felt an obligation as a result of all these good experiences to share the story of the people who made all this possible. We owe a lot to them for getting us started, and that's what our book, Hands Off, is all about.
We thank you guys for listening to us this evening, and we're happy to answer any questions this evening or by email. And those are our email addresses. If something comes up later and you want to email us, we'd be happy to answer your questions.
Hey, this is Carl Steffen. Yeah, that was very fascinating, and I recognize a lot of the names you said. There's people I knew as a little kid there. And you mentioned Tom Gatch. Yeah, I was the NAA observer for that flight when I was 17. But thank you so much for all your history. It just brings back tons of memories. Thank you very much.
Sure, Carl, of course. I'm glad you could be there. Again, I haven't seen you since then.
You look slightly different. I might too.
And we've had a lot of fun doing this book, and we learned a lot, and there's a lot more stories that we couldn't put into a 30-minute presentation here, but happy to answer any other questions you might have. or you can throw darts at us.
I hope that old Akron hangar is still there, isn't it?
Oh, it's in great shape too. Both our hangars are there. The small one I showed you, the Wingfoot Lake hangar, looks like brand new. It's all been refurbished. That's where the Zeppelin NTs are kept. But the big air dock at Akron Fulton Airport was all refurbished, all reskinned on the outside, and then inside it was painted. When Earthwinds was there, it was real dark and black, all black paint. But now it was painted, sandblasted and painted white. And there's 17 acres of surface on that thing. So you imagine that how much that job cost Lockheed Martin. But it was recently sold. The city of Akron owned that hangar. They were keeping it, and then Google bought it. So they're going to make some airships there.
Isn't Eric Schmidt building a rigid airship in there? One of the
that's his intent.
Yeah. Getting a lot of press attention for that.
Just make a comment to you guys. This is Tim here. I really was fascinated hearing that your club had a lot to do with the Fly movie. When I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 years old, we were in Alamogordo, New Mexico at the Space Museum Hall of Fame that's still there. And they didn't have an IMAX theater there. They had something called an OmniMax. So instead of a great big flat screen in front of you, you're inside of a dome and you were immersed in the movie. And the first time I saw a movie in there, it was To Fly. And I'll tell you, it was spectacular to a young kid who's never been off the ground, and as every kid kind of does, of dreaming of flying. You go from just that kind of tight square image to where they just blow it up as you start taking off, and that really left a mark for me there. And it's fascinating to hear that you guys, maybe not directly, but the people that you knew were heavily involved with that, because that was certainly a fantastic movie. I've only seen it the one time, but it certainly has left a memory in my mind.
Well, there's a lot more we could say about that, Tim. Mike and I have each flown that 35,000 cubic foot balloon that was used to make the To Fly movie. People always ask us about that extra long net that appears in that. And the reason that we use that extra long net is at one time our club was thinking about using natural gas to fly, but they couldn't get off the ground with more than two people in a 35,000 cubic foot balloon filled with natural gas, which is plentiful in Ohio. So they're going to cut open at the hemisphere one of our balloons and add a big section to it. And to do that, first they had to have a big net. So they built the big net first, but they never had the guts or the time to cut open, do surgery on one of those great 35,000 cubic foot racing balloons. But that's what the long net was for. It just makes the movie that much more spectacular, I think, along with the bunting on the equator.
Oh, thanks. That's fascinating.
Great fights in that balloon.
Hey guys, we had a question from Mike Conwell. Is Goodyear still interested in unbranded lighter than air?
Don't know. I don't have anything on that, Mike.
I don't either. Do you know anything, or?
No, I was just checking. I know that most corporations are getting more risk averse, but I was still wondering if they were interested in other balloons besides their dirigibles.
I don't think they build anything for other than their own account. Goodyear's been pretty protective of that symbol for their own use, and I don't know what they've done anything for other individuals or companies. Certainly wouldn't have Goodyear's name on it.
The big air dock was owned by it was Goodyear Zeppelin, then Goodyear Aircraft in World War II, and then Goodyear Aerospace in the 50s, and then I think Loral bought it when Goodyear was it was under a hostile takeover,
Mhm.
Morale had it, then Lockheed Martin. So lots of people have owned it. But to answer your question, they were building aerostats in there up to 2 years ago for use in the Persian Gulf, for carrying cameras and sensors and so forth aloft, because we actually saw some of the stuff in there. And but that's all gone now. Lockheed Martin lost the contract for that. So there's really no association with Goodyear at all. And in Goodyear's airships now, they used to build their own and own envelopes, and they recycled World War II cars, but now they're using Zeppelin NTs. So the Zeppelin engineers will come over here and they assemble them in the Wingfoot Lake hangar.
There's still a great mystique about the Goodyear Zeppelin hangar, the big one that Mike referred to at Akron Fulton Airport, because it's not open to the public. You can't just wander in there and look around. It's unbelievably huge, almost 800 feet long and 150 feet tall or something. It's unbelievably huge, but it's well protected, and you have to go into security to get inside. Mike and I spent a lot of time in there when we were working on the Earth Winds project because we had special credentials to get in. But it's the whole mystique is built up around this building within the Akron community.
All right.
Well,
Any other questions or for Bill and Mike?
Susan, I'm just going to say I dropped a link to the book. It's available on Amazon, so I've dropped it in the chat if anybody's interested in that. It was also in the email that went out about the meeting as well. So it's available there.
I saw that link go out. So I thought I would do a product placement as well. Bill Armstrong wrote another book here. It came out about 12 years ago called Just Wind. And it talks about the Lightheart flight across the Atlantic, the attempt there by Thomas Gatch, and then a lot of the great stories about Larry Newman and Mike's involvement in the Earth Wind projects in the early 90s and stuff. So it's also a very good read if you guys are looking for some good gas ballooning stories in here as well. If hands off, it's not enough for you.
Thank you, Tim. Your check is in the mail. Thanks a lot. We've been actually, Mike and I have been very gratified with the response to this book. We've gotten some very nice endorsements and comments from leadership within the gas ballooning community and others. And so we're quite pleased with the response we've gotten so far, and we hope you enjoy it as well. So thanks for
thanks for having
this evening.
Well, Mike and Bill, thank you so much. The presentation was wonderful. I think probably everybody's going to be buying that book. I know I am. And Tim, I appreciate your putting us together with these two guys. It was a very informative and very, very interesting and historical information. So thanks again, and we'll welcome you to Texas anytime you want to come.
Oh, I'd love to come back.
Thanks.
Okay.
We'll see you at Tres Amigos sometime, I hope.
It sounds like a plan. All right.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, guys.
All right.
We'll
Thank